So we have 5 classes left with today. What I want to do today is to discuss democracy, the deepening of democracy, and then next week, globalization. And that would leave us then with 3 classes that are open either to return to substantive themes in the course or to discuss general ideas, the way of thinking, the way of understanding structural change, and the ideals that inform the argument, and the assumptions about history and society and humanity on which such an argument relies. But I'm open to your suggestions. So if you have other proposals for how we should use the final weeks of the course, please speak with me or just email me your suggestions. Are there any questions about this final writing exercise? As you can see, it's not a research paper. It's an opportunity for you to engage the argument of the course, and by engaging it, to develop your own voice. It's very hard to think programmatically in our contemporary context, and this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for you not only to develop your substantive position, but also to develop a way of thinking, a method, a form of discourse. It's not a research paper, as I said, and you are free to consult one another or consult people altogether outside the class, to share your drafts, to comment or have your drafts commented on by others. The only restraint on such collaboration is the normal restraint in intellectual life that you should be able to say of the final product in good faith that it is largely the expression of your own mind. Any questions about this exercise? Yes?
You want us to cite any outside advising or help?
No, you don't have to cite anything. You could cite lots of things or nothing at all. So you're entirely free in method as well as in substance. If I didn't want to be surprised, I wouldn't have designed the assignment in this form. Yes? Same question? No. Any other questions? Very good. So today the theme is democracy and the reinvention of democracy. And we come to this theme in 2 ways. So, and by describing these 2 ways in which we come to it, I want once again to situate us in the plan of the course. So one way in which I've organized the argument is by a criticism of institutionally conservative social democracy. Because institutionally conservative social democracy is the default position of the contemporary progressives. And you will recall the themes that we covered there, the way of providing public services, the relation between finance and the real economy. Those 2 are at least barely within the horizon of the established discourse. And then 3 more themes that are beyond that horizon. The hierarchical segmentation of the economy, and in particular the confinement of the most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, to insular vanguards. The practical basis of social solidarity or social cohesion, and the inadequacy of money transfers organized by the state as a social cement. And now the problem of democracy, the organization of political life, and the relation of politics to structure and its transformation. So that is, as it were, one of the ways in which the plan of the course has been generated, by exploring what lies beyond the frontiers of institutionally conservative social democracy. But implicitly in the plan of the course, in the argument of the course, there's another view which, regardless of social democracy and its limitations, considers what are the main transformative projects that could supply the content of the progressive cause today. And in that respect, my suggestion has been that there are three main axes. So the first is democratizing the market, or more generally, reorganizing the economic order in the contemporary context, and associating the cause of inclusion, empowerment, and equality with the material interests of humanity, and especially with our stake in broad-based economic growth. In that first axis, there are three large themes that I have addressed. The first is the theme of the fate of the most advanced practice of production, whether it will continue to be quarantined in fringes in each sector of the economy, or widely spread throughout the production system. The confinement of the knowledge economy, its present insular form, has, I have argued, momentous consequences for both economic stagnation and economic inequality. So this is a theme that lies at the forefront of our political economic concerns today. It's at the center of the emerging debate about growth and development in the whole world. The second economic theme is the theme of the relation of finance to the real economy, how finance can be enlisted in the service of production and serve the real economy rather than being allowed simply to serve itself. And the third theme is the relation of labor to capital and the empowerment of labor in an age in which an increasing proportion of the labor force throughout the world is reduced to precarious employment. And having in mind the long-term horizon in which we would seek decisively to reshape the relation of people to machines and to reaffirm the ascendancy of the two higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation, in opposition to the inferior, the defective, and the transitory form of free labor, wage labor. That's the economic project. Then the second is the educational project. And the educational project is simply one of the faces of a larger concern with the transformation of our consciousness and our powers. But the ideas about education bring this larger concern into focus and serve, as it were, as its cutting edge. And here, in this part of the discussion, you will remember that I have focused on a very particular model of teaching and learning. One that is analytical, selective, cooperative, and above all, dialectical. against the background of a transformation of culture that radicalizes the experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. And then there's the third axis. The third axis is the deepening of democracy. The deepening of democracy is the counterpart to the democratizing of the market. And with democracy, as with the market, the idea is that it has no obvious, natural, and necessary institutional form. Our conception of democracy, the range of our ambitions for democracy, is intimately related to the institutional forms that it assumes. And as our conception becomes more ambitious, we must press for alternative institutional forms, and in pressing for these alternative institutional forms, we come to rethink our idea of democracy. So that's just by way of background of setting the stage for this discussion of democracy today. And I want to begin with then the basic conception of democracy. Then to say a word about the conceptual and the institutional histories of democracy, the background to our present debate. Then third, the kind of democracy that we should seek in the setting of a project like this one that I've been exploring. And fourth, and most importantly, the heart of today's discussion, the institutional content of this idea of democracy. So, what is democracy? The conventional conception is it's the government of the majority qualified by the rights of the minorities. Representative democracy required in large states. But on these views that I've been discussing here, democracy must mean something more than that. So that conventional definition is, as it were, only a beginning, a first step. Democracy must mean that the structure of society, the terms of our relations to one another, become, in fact, and not just in doctrine, our creation. All of the structures of social life are frozen fighting. They result from a relative containment or a temporary interruption of our struggle over the shape of society, over the shape of the terms of our access to one another. And then they may become, these terms of social life, entrenched, so they may appear to us in a delusive form, as if they were things, as if they were just part of the furniture of the universe, rather than what they really are, which is our own artifacts. So every part of the institutions of society, on this view, must help us repossess these structures of social life so that we can deal with them, in fact, as our artifacts, so that we can be their masters, so that they not appear to us as if they were a blind fate. And so that each of us, all of us, can participate in this reshaping of the terms of social life. In particular, in opposition to two situations, which are fatal constraints on democratic hopes. So one situation is the situation in which the people, the majority who are supposedly governing, are for most of the time asleep. They're asleep. And they wake up only from time to time. In revolutionary moments. And in those long interludes, most of the time when they are asleep, power is exercised in their name by a cadre of professional politicians and their bureaucratic instruments, often ruling in the name of expertise as well as a popular legitimacy. Now that's then related to another situation that limits the hopes of democracy, and that is the situation in which crisis, change depends on crisis. So the rule is then, no trauma, no transformation. If the people are asleep most of the time, if change depends on crisis, the practical consequence is that the dead rule over the living. In this circumstance of low-energy democracy or relative democracy, which is the only kind of democracy that exists in the world, the law, which is the expression of the democratic will, is in fact only a series of episodic interventions in a form of social life that for the most part is left untouched. So the alternative view of democracy is the view that democracy takes hold of the structure, subjects the structure to pressure, makes patent its artifactual character, and allows us then to repossess it. Diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. In that democracy, let's call it a high-energy democracy, democracy becomes, in a sense, the perpetual creation of the new, and not just the rule of the majority qualified by the rights of minorities. Now let me stop there. I just wanted to suggest these initial conceptions, just to begin to move the ground of our ideas about democracy, and ask whether you have any comments or questions before I go into the historical part of my argument. Yes?
So I think that what you described is, even though you describe it very beautiful, it's like a Marxian idea. the shape that we see the social life as artifacts that is not part of our decisions, it's not
Yes.
a Marxian. And I think that it suggests that there is a problem with the democracy in the world today because it's a liberal democracy in most cases. And there's a perception within it that we are individuals, which is, if you think about it, even if we as men, we use language, when we think towards, so it's a social issue, the way that we think, even
Yes.
that we think. So I think that if we want to establish a democracy, which is, you call it high energy, we need to think about a guided democracy. And then that should help people be more free in their shaping of their relationship. And the only way of doing that is by having people who will educate about it. And then you come to the problem of tyranny. Tyranny.
Yes.
Because if you have someone who has the knowledge to explain to people what are the processes they need to go through in order to come about to that situation, you can make it mad. It could lose its path because there is something about liberalism that protects us from that, and there's something very problematic in the social, in the Marxian way that come about to tyranny in the end. So I want.
But what is the Marxian way? Because Karl Marx himself had really no programmatic conception of democracy. He had no proposals for the organization of a democratic state.
Yes, but the people who call themselves Marxians, in the end, like fell in love in the Platonic gods of the country way.
Yes.
You know, to have that cadre in the end, in the Bolshevik
Yes, well,
state,
that's
they
the
had
idea.
Other cadre,
Yeah.
so.
That's the idea that there's a revolutionary vanguard that by virtual representation stands in the place of the collective interest, speaks for the collective. It's the opposite, of course, of what I'm saying.
Yes, of course.
Yes, because the central faith of democracy is belief in the constructive genius of ordinary men and women. So the democracy is, among other things, an epistemological procedure, a procedure of discovery, in which we think that we can discover the path only through this form of organized, decentralized contest, and that there is no elite of enlightened guides who would be better than what we can find through the deepening of democratic experimentalism. So I don't know about Marx, because Marx was silent on these questions for the most part. But this conception is certainly an anti-Leninist conception. It's a conception against the idea of a vanguard that virtually represents the people. Remember that at different points in the course I suggested this idea, this unique feature of our contemporary situation. We recognize the need for structural alternatives. The problems of contemporary societies can be resolved only through institutional innovations. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we can no longer bring ourselves to believe in definitive institutional formulas. So we must experiment. Now, experimentation is not open. It's not a black box, because the organization of an economy and of a form of politics that have this attribute of broad-based experimentation may lead us in a very particular substantive direction. In other words, given the background and the context, very particular economic and political institutions may be the ones we need to perform this task. So it's not an abdication of the work of institutional design. It can point us in a very particular direction. But in a sense, it's a response to this problem, that we need structural alternatives, but we wish no longer to succumb to a structural dogmatism. Democracy is the solution to that problem, among other things. It's a way of discovering and generating and implementing structural alternatives when there is no permanent, reliable institutional blueprint and no cadre of people with the expertise to guide us. Then we turn to democracy. So that's one way in which we would come to the idea of democracy. Now, let's for a moment think about the historical context of these debates, and in that way clarify the point of departure. So first, the history of ideas. The central organizing polarity in the history of political theory in the modern West is the contrast described by the Franco-Swiss publicist Benjamin Constant at the beginning of the 19th century between the modern... What?
What is his name? Benjamin
Constant.
Constant.
Constant. Between the ancient and the modern republic. The liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. So the modern republic is the republic of real, in the flesh, interest-bearing individuals, for whom, inevitably, politics is an exceptional activity. In their ordinary private lives, they're mainly concerned with the pursuit of their interests. And they then delegate political activity to a syndicate of professional politicians. The ancient republic, according to this contrast, was a mythical, a mythologized version of ancient Rome and ancient Sparta. So a public space in which the individual is concerned for the whole of his life with politics, lives for politics, thinks politically, is a selfless citizen. So what has often happened at many different points in the history of political theory is that this idea of radical republicanism is evoked as the alternative to the privatized space of modern politics. But it's really only a fantasy. It never existed in any real society. And so the evocation of this ideal, the ideal of the mythical Sparta or the mythical Rome, is in a way an excuse, a license to accept the present situation of the liberty of the moderns. So what I want to propose as the point of departure for the argument is that we resist succumbing to this illusion, this false alternative of the ancient republic, and we take as the point of departure intransigently, unconditionally, the modern republic, such as it exists. And the question is how the boundaries of consciousness in that modern republic can be extended. And here at the most abstract level, then, is a statement of the problem. in the modern republic, as Benjamin Constant describes it, there are basically two categories of activities. First, there are the normal activities, the moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take largely for granted. And then there are the exceptional activities by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we struggle over the transformation of a part of the framework. And these two categories of activities appear very distant from each other. Now, what would we desire as a form of empowerment? We would want the distance between these two categories of activities to diminish, so that the moves by which we, from time to time, challenge and change pieces of the framework come to arise more continuously or naturally from our ordinary activities and cease to have an ecstatic quality. And then, to the extent that that happened, we would become masters of the framework. So that is the general character of the way in which the quality, the nature of the modern republic would be little by little changed or extended. It's not the jump from the modern republic to the ancient republic. It's not the abandonment of the perspective of the real, incarnate, interest-bearing individual by the standpoint of the selfless citizen. It's the deepening or the expansion of the horizon of that real individual. And that then suggests a whole institutional project. What institutional innovations in particular could be responsive to this ideal that I just described? Now consider the institutional history of democracy. There's an inner circle and an outer circle. So the inner circle is the circle of the evolving institutional arrangements of the modern democracies. And as I will later comment, the variations that exist in this inner circle are extraordinarily limited. The institutional history of democracy has been extremely restrictive. There's a tiny range of variations in the organization of democratic states in the modern world. And then there's the outer circle. The outer circle is composed of the alternatives that the leftists or the revolutionaries have proposed to what they have described as bourgeois democracies. And the characteristic of the outer circle is the reliance on direct or participatory democracy, a democracy of workers' councils or Soviets, characteristically adopted only in brief revolutionary interludes. So there have been many attempts to implement this alternative, but none of these attempts has ever lasted for more than a very short time. And when it has failed, when each of these attempts has failed, it has then given way to some form of authoritarian despotism, one of those vanguards that we discussed before. So I want to make now the analogous move that I made with respect to the debate about the ancient and modern republics, and say, we should forget about this outer circle. It's an illusion. Although we may be able to recover some of its ambitions in the transformation of the inner circle. And what about the inner circle? So there's a very small range of institutional alternatives. In the pure parliamentary or the presidential regimes generated in modern constitutional history. There are the European parliamentary regimes, especially the English parliamentary regime. And there's the American presidential regime, widely copied in Latin America. The key constitutional mechanism in the design of the American presidential regime is the deliberate association of two principles: the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics, implemented through Madison's system of checks and balances. On the assumption that these two principles are naturally and necessarily connected. But I want later to argue, we might reaffirm the liberal principle, but repudiate the conservative one. We could have many centers of power, of constitutional initiative, and then a series of constitutional mechanisms rapidly to resolve impasse among the political branches of government. And in all of these democracies, the democracies of the 19th century and of the early 20th century, with their alternative presidential or parliamentary forms, society was kept at a very low level of political mobilization, of organized popular engagement in political life. Thus, the normal situation that most of the time the people are sleeping, except when there is a crisis. Initially, in the early 19th century, the low level of political mobilization was institutionalized or formalized through qualifications to the suffrage, property qualifications or educational qualifications. Only a cadre of notables could vote. When there was a debate in the middle of the 19th century about lifting the qualifications to the suffrage, both the conservatives and the radicals believed that the universal suffrage would have revolutionary effects, and that the people would use the vote to change the regime of property, the economic order. And of course, they were both mistaken, as we now know. The suffrage was made universal, and the revolutionary effects were not produced. In the context of societies that were very unequal, in which the citizenry was most of the time largely passive, and in which money could be used to influence or control politics. So the informal qualifications to the suffrage then supplied the functional equivalents to the formal qualifications to the suffrage used in the early 19th century. And ever since then, political society has been kept at a very low level of mobilization. Against that historical background, there arises the belief in conservative political science and statecraft that politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional. So in other words, if politics does not go in the direction of Madison then it goes in the direction of Mussolini. That's the basic belief in this tradition. What it, of course, excludes is the possibility that politics could be both hot and institutional. That we could have political institutions that raise in an organized fashion the level of popular engagement in political life. Now, what then about the constitutional innovations of the 20th century? There have been two main kinds of innovations. The first has to do with rights, especially social and economic rights, and the second to do with some modest flexibilization or tinkering in the design of the government. So first with rights. The constitutions that followed the First World War, then in the interwar period and continuing after the Second World War, were prodigal in the promise of rights. Some of these constitutions began to promise everything: health, education, happiness, you name it. It's all in the Constitution. Unaccompanied by any institutional machinery to assure the reality of these promises. So there were constitutional promises, but there was no redesign of the political or economic order proportionate to these promises. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier class, this was exactly the evolution of the social doctrine of the Church, of the Catholic Church. So you see how this was a deeply entrenched phenomenon in the political consciousness of the modern West. In the late 19th century, at the time of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, in 1891, the social doctrine of the Church takes the form of a set of promises of rights. And of rights in particular designed to muffle class conflict, diminishing economic injustice. Then in the middle of the 20th century, between the wars, the Church gradually evolved toward a particular institutional proposal, which in today's vocabulary we would describe as a communitarian corporatism. And it is most fully laid out in Pius XI's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno of 1931. And it could be compared to a kind of guild socialism or corporatist capitalism. These were the ideas in vogue at that time, as we discussed when I dealt with the New Deal. Managed competition, concerted action between big capital and big labor under the eye of the government. The unions as quasi-state organizations guided by the state. And the objective to affirm some degree of harmony and economic justice, of social harmony and economic justice in the conditions of a very unequal so-called capitalist economy. It was actually very close to the institutional ideas of Italian fascism. And it became discredited in the eyes of the Church itself. So the Church then abandoned this institutional program, and instead of formulating an alternative institutional program, the popes then reverted to the earlier situation. So the encyclicals of the late 20th century and the early 20th century are like the encyclicals of the late 19th century, once again prodigal in the promises of rights and lacking in any institutional machinery. So that's, as it were, half of the constitutional innovations of the 20th century. All these promises, no institutional machinery. The second half was a series of experiments in the design of the government, mainly intended to allow for greater flexibility and stability in multi-party systems. So there was a spectrum of ways of combining presidential and parliamentary principles. So it would be both a president and a parliament. There would be two routes to the formulation of the national will. The government could rely on both the president and the parliament. And the president would have certain initiative or powers in resolving impasse among the political parties. So you could see this as a way to hasten the pace of politics, except for this fact, that because political society remained at a very low level of energy, in economies that were very unequal and very unequally organized, all of politics continued to be conducted under the shadow of these dominant economic interests and money commanding politics. So these were very modest experiments in the redesign of the state. And these dualistic experiments, to call them that way, dualism because there's the parliamentary principle and a presidential role. These dualistic experiments, instead of representing a first step to the creation of high-energy democracies with ambitious agendas of structural reform, represented a kind of technocratic engineering, making the state more flexible, more responsive to changing circumstance, but against the background of an overwhelming political demobilization in society. So the significance of these compressed allusions to constitutional history is simply this. The outer circle, as I described it, the appeal to workers' councils, direct democracy, is a feint, a pretense, a diversion. The inner circle is very narrow. And the key to understanding its narrowness is that the potential of those modest experiments in the redesign of the state was largely neutered by the overwhelming setting, climate of political demobilization. So there were modest improvements in the flexibility of the government without the creation of an adequate base for the reiterated practice of structural reform. And instead of structural reform, instead of an institutional machinery in politics or in the economy capable of generating structural alternatives, what do we get? We get the promises of rights. So that was the other part of the constitutional innovations. Well, that's all I wanted to say by way of the by way of the history. The conceptual history and the institutional history. Should I go on to the institutional discussion, or should we discuss that for a moment? It's really striking now, because many countries in the world in the 20th century have formulated constitutions. And the constitutional jurists have vast libraries, and they study all of this. And you know what goes on in the making of constitutions. It's as if you were dealing with the periodic table, except that the periodic table has only like 5 elements. And so the constitution making is the combination of these elements. Like there's the French Constitution, there's the German Constitution, there's the American. We'll take a little of each. What makes it so absurd, so astonishing, is that this history is an accidental history that generated a tiny range of variations, a minuscule subset of a much larger range of constitutional possibilities. So why are they taking the arrangements just from this tiny subset, which arose, as it were, just by accident in this part of the world, the North Atlantic world, and was then disseminated throughout the globe? It's really difficult to understand. And what's most difficult is to understand the complete abdication of the constitutional imagination, of the constitutional jurists. You would think that would be their task, to imagine the evolution of the constitutional arrangements, to extend the subset. But no, all they've done is this little set of recombinations. Yes? Excuse me?
Do you think that colonialism might have something to do with that little variation?
Well, I think something else. So I think you say colonialism. Of course, literally colonialism had something to do, because some of the empires imposed their constitutional arrangements on their colonies. But now that colonialism is gone, there's something else that's much more powerful, which is mental colonialism. So this is the striking thing in the world. So you have these large countries, like China, or, India, Brazil, and the intellectual elites, not just the political and economic elites, live under the tyranny of this very small range of ideas. So, in the intellectual life of these countries, take 2 very different countries in radically different situations, China and Brazil. Basically, intellectual life is organized into 2 factions. Shrunken, fossilized Marxism, and the copies of American-style social science and policy discourse, especially economics. Now, what's happened in Marxism is that it's been hollowed out. So the zeitgeist provided an axe to the intelligentsia. It cut Marxism in half. It threw out the good part, the transformative aspirations, and kept the bad part, the historical fatalism. So they don't actually believe in the heroic claims of Marxist social theory about the laws of historical transformation, the indivisible character of the modes of production, and so forth. But they continue to use the vocabulary. And in particular as a kind of alibi for their prostration. So there's a system in the world, there are these regimes, you can't do anything because of globalization, and so forth. Then there's the other part of the American-style social science, especially economics, conducted in the spirit of a right-wing Hegelianism. The real is rational. There's an evolution of the world of convergence to the best institutions and practices. And reason shows why they're the best and why they're necessary and so forth. And so actually, these two forms of intellectual life, which are the main components of the mental colonialism in these countries, appear to be opposites, enemies, but they're not enemies. They're like two versions of the same thing. And that's what results as a kind of pastiche in which they're mixed together often, and in this degenerate and combined form become the lingua franca of the intelligentsia. Now, in principle, the juris might provide a source of challenge to this mentality, to these forms of consciousness, because their subject matter is the subject matter of institutional details, and thus institutional possibilities. But because of the evolution of modern legal thought, they have largely failed to do so. They've imported from the United States and from Germany this idea that law is a system of policies and principles, idealizing the present institutional order. And in this way, they have undermined or compromised the transformative possibilities of the legal imagination and have rendered themselves incapable of challenging those forms of thought. So that's the answer that I would give to your question, that more important than this explicit colonialism of political power is the implicit, the mental colonialism that continues in power and force in these great countries. Each of them is large enough to imagine itself as a different world, but its ability to imagine itself in that way is squandered by submission to the mental colonialism. Yes?
May I ask a follow-up? Then what role do large institutions like the World Bank play in structural adjustment
Yes.
programs, etc., where how free are countries to decide on their economic?
Well, we're going to come to that in the discussion of globalization, because my position will be that there is a particular form of globalization in place, and it does impose constraints. And for these strong national projects that I'm describing, we would want to revise the present world order. Nevertheless, that can't serve as an excuse for this prostration, because we know as a matter of fact that even given the present constraints, different parts of the world have responded in radically different ways to the same constraints. China, for example, by contrast to Latin America. So it can't be that this is a sufficient explanation. But the basic point about mental colonialism is very, very significant. Without it, it's impossible to understand the experience of these countries. So let me just tell you a little story that is revealing about the moral and political significance of this. So for many years, I have seen here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a long string of talented middle-class students who come from Brazil. They've been very good test takers, they're very clever, and they're admitted to a doctorate in economics at Harvard or MIT. Now, characteristically, they arrive on the scene with the intention of writing a thesis that would defy the established economics, a revolutionary thesis. in economic theory. Now, when they come here and they announce these intentions to their professors, the professors are deeply puzzled. They have no idea what these people are talking about. And it's not that the professors prohibit them from implementing these projects. It's that they're unable to help them. Then these young Brazilians are unable to do what they set out to do. They have no background. They don't have. They haven't prepared themselves in thought, in social theory, in philosophy, in the history of ideas, and even in the history of economics themselves. They don't have the equipment, and the people around them can't provide them with the equipment. So they then surrender. And they end up writing a thesis that applies the established apparatus of economic analysis to some trivial feature of national reality, like the hyperinflation in Brazil. So they end up doing the opposite of what they set out to do. That is, they end up applying the existing theory that they had wanted to defy and replace to some aspect of the local reality, vindicating its uses. So they then have a profound experience of failure. And they think like this: well, I couldn't become what I wanted to become, a thinker. At least I won't be poor. So I come from a society in which middle class is nothing. I'll go back. I'll join the central bank. From there, I'll jump to private finance. I'll become rich and influential in a society in which money is admired and its powers are recognized. So Rousseau says in Emile, they couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. And this is the phenomenon. And these people then, for years, manage the economic plans of the country and help conduct the affairs of the Brazilian state. And their consciousness, their sensibility penetrated the assumptions of the Brazilian elite. That's mental colonialism. So it's not something abstract or floating. It's something that has a human reality. And without appreciating that, you can't understand what's happened to these countries. Because there's no alternative to thought, and it has to come from somewhere, and institutional alternatives have to be informed by intellectual inspiration. So I don't think that this has to be forever, this situation that I've described. To understand it, to describe it for what it is already the beginning of attacking it and overthrowing it. So then we come to the question of the alternatives in the light of this history. Did you want to say something? Yes.
I had a brief question about the paradox you described when under the thinking of government category, where you have low levels of energy, so to
Yes.
speak, and incredibly unequal societies.
Yes.
So in my field research in Pakistan studying democracy, for example, I've met many people who've been very disenfranchised and don't even participate in the vote because of how economically unequal that society is and how it kind of bars people from thinking that political transformation is happening. And so I'm wondering, do we in some ways need that cadre of technicians and politicians who are specialized in order to begin moving people towards a transformative potential?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two different things. So, two things that are radically different, but that may seem to be somehow alike. So, one thing is this notion that there's some kind of expertise that can guide us. It's the vanguardist idea, the Leninist idea, also the technocratic idea, that is then the replacement for democracy and that justifies guided democracy. Now, but there's another idea, which is that a deepened democracy does not dispense with a bureaucratic apparatus. On the contrary, the deeper the democracy and the wider the range of its ambitions, the more important it is to build a state. And there are agendas for the building of the state that are associated with different centuries. So there's a 19th century agenda of professional meritocratic administration. Then there's a 20th century agenda of administrative efficiency, which must mean something different in the age of the knowledge economy and experimentalist production from what it meant in the age of Fordist mass production. And then there's a 21st century agenda of experimentalism in the service of the state in the development of public policy. Example, the state should not have to either adopt a policy universally or not adopt it at all. It should be able to try it out in particular circumstances, because that's the only way in which we could advance experimentally. So that's the building of the state. So what I'm saying is that the creation of a high-energy democracy capable of mastering the structure, taking society to a higher level of organized popular engagement in political life, does not render the bureaucratic apparatus of the state superfluous. On the contrary, it makes it all the more necessary. And a capable state and a deepened democracy are partners of each other. The state, reorganized through these three agendas that I've described, is the indispensable instrument of a deepened democracy. Yes?
The last sentence, I have a problem with it.
Yes.
Because there are two authorities. The authorities, one is society, in the way that it handles itself. The other is politics. And when you have something who can't be organized within the society, the politics or the use of force become more applicable. Like in certain places when there's a problem, there's a custom of not loitering in the street, you don't need high fines of the state.
Yes.
In the place that it is custom to loiter the street, you use high fines. So
You use?
you find the people more
Yes.
in order to
Yes.
make sure that it doesn't happen. So the thoughts that I learned throughout my life is to take parts of the interference of the state and make it something that is being handled in the society without the interference of the state. And then you can achieve a more, the way that the society is being organized is more free in that way. And the idea of a capable state with a capable society working together hand by hand, maybe there is a contradiction between the two, no?
No, I don't think so.
So-
But I think that will be then the discussion of the institutions. But we weren't talking about that just now. We were talking about the relation of the democratic state in a high-energy democracy, in which the temperature of politics goes up, the pace of politics is hastened, and the professional organization of the state. Because it sometimes may seem that the deepening of democracy contradicts the interest in an organized bureaucratic state, but it doesn't.
So
I mean, if you
define-
take something very simple, a professional civil service, state careers. State careers are important to a high-energy democracy.
Okay. So
As long as the political force is in command. So this is different from the idea of the substitution of popular will by technocratic expertise. The technocratic expertise is subordinate to the political will, but it's still necessary.
Okay, so in the real world, I just want to say there is a problem that when you put capable people, even as a civil servant, and they need to do what the political we decided, because they are capable, it sometimes look like they fight with it. Like even it's a problem. I'm not saying that I understand what you.
That's a question of political authority.
Okay.
And the greater the political authority sustained with a popular basis, the less that becomes a problem. If the politicians are weak, if they're the instruments of lobbies, then they become vulnerable to these incursions by the professional bureaucrats.
Okay.
So let's then turn to the agenda of institutional transformation, a high-energy democracy. What are the criteria? It's a triple criterion. And what are the institutional arrangements? The series of institutional innovations that would give content to this idea of a high-energy democracy. So the criterion is that it be a democracy that be capable of mastering the structure of society and of generating structural alternatives, of organizing what I described as the perpetual creation of the new, that it not depend on crisis as the enabling condition of change, and that therefore it overthrow the rule of the living by the dead. Now, then, what institutional arrangements, what direction of institutional arrangements would give content to this? Now, here I want to make a methodological clarification, which applies to the whole argument. Remember, I said that in this course, for the most part, I'm choosing a middle distance. That is, I'm describing proposals that are neither very close to what exists nor very far away from what exists. In a programmatic argument, what matters is the direction and the initial steps by which to move in that direction. A programmatic argument is not a blueprint. It's the exploration of a direction. And the direction can be described at points close to what exists or points far away from what exists. I deliberately choose here points that are at a middle distance, because these middle points tend to be more revealing of the conceptual structure of the ideas. They have a scholastic advantage. But that's not what we do in actual politics. In the language of political persuasion, we do the opposite. We spur in this middle level because the proposals made at the middle distance will tend to be too far from what exists to be feasible, but not far enough to arouse enthusiasm. So in the actual practice of transformative politics and political persuasion, we prefer the immediate, the down payments on the direction that are tangible, that can be touched now, and the distant, the prophetic. And thus the language of transformative politics is at once practical and prophetic, as opposed to scholastic, in the fashion that I deliberately adopt here. But you have to correct for this feature, and your mind has to operate at all points in these spectrums. So with that clarification in hand, I suggest 5 sets of institutional innovations that would begin to give content to the idea of a high-energy democracy. The first set has to do with the raising of the temperature of politics. That is, the level of organized popular engagement in political life. And here, the point of departure is the repudiation of the conservative principle that politics must be either cold and institutional or hot and anti-institutional, either demobilizing or Caesaristic. So what we would want would be a series of innovations that would tend to raise the level of engagement in a lasting fashion. Now, what are such innovations? They're entirely familiar. So some have to do with electoral regimes. Now, the practical effect of electoral regimes is entirely context-bound. So in a country with multi-party proportional representation, like, say, Italy, the introduction of a majoritarian system, first past the post-electoral regime, could have a mobilizing effect. But in another country with very few political parties and no proportional representation, like the United States, it could be the opposite. There's no constant effect of electoral regimes. Their effect entirely depends on history and circumstance. Then, second, the relation between money and politics and the financing, not just of political, electoral activity in the narrow sense, but of all forms of public action, including action in the so-called third sector between the state and business. And third, the access of the by political parties and organized social movements to the means of mass communication. The media companies must hold their revocable licenses conditioned on providing free access to the means of mass communication, not just to the political parties, but to the organized social movements. So there isn't a silver bullet. But there are a series of initiatives that, in their combined and cumulative effect, would tend to raise the level of organized political mobilization. Another is to make the vote mandatory, as it is in many contemporary democracies. The level of mobilization in society is not a brute fact. It's not a fact about culture. So it's often said about the United States, for example, that the American population, the electorate, is demobilized, politically demobilized. But give me some of these innovations, and I'll show you a different United States. So what is attributed to culture is, in fact, to a large extent, the artifact of these arrangements in the organization of politics. Now we come to the second set of innovations, the hastening of the pace of politics. Consider it in the context of an American-style presidential regime. There are two political branches. There's the separation of powers. The system is designed not only to produce impasse, but to perpetuate impasse. We could maintain the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, but equip the Constitution with means for the rapid resolution of impasse. Example, in the presence of an impasse between the two political branches, either branch, the President or the Congress, could unilaterally call for anticipated elections. But the exercise of the constitutional prerogative would always have to be bilateral. That is, the branch that called the early elections would have to call it for both branches, and thus pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And by this simple device, you could transform the presidential regime into a machine for the acceleration of politics. In societies that are very large and very unequal, especially when they are federal in structure, the presidential regime has an advantage, which it allows a direct march to the center of power. And the election of a president with a strong plebiscitarian mandate. But it has a disadvantage. The disadvantage is that it was organized to perpetuate impasse, and thus inhibit the political transformation of society. So if you take the presidential regimes in Latin America, where the American system was copied, the president is elected promising the sky to the masses, and then he finds in power a system that was designed to tie his hands. He is powerful to favor or disfavor interests, but not to promote structural change. Or another constitutional device would be comprehensive programmatic plebiscites in the presence of an impasse, as distinguished from the single-issue referenda that are common, for example, in the United States. Now we come to the third set of constitutional innovations, of institutional innovations in the organization of democracy, having to do with the relation between central initiative by the central government, and local initiative in the periphery. Now, it might be in a federal system, and then the problem is the relation between the powers of the federal government and the powers of the states and municipalities. But it might also be in a unitary state, like the United Kingdom. Because in a unitary state, there's still the issue presented of the relation between the powers of the central government and the prospect of devolution. The conventional way of thinking is that there's a simple inverse relation between central initiative and decentralized initiative. But there isn't. There isn't this inverse relation. It is possible in principle to have stronger central initiative and more decentralization or devolution at the same time. So consider it in the context of a federal system. The official doctrine of federalism is an experimentalist doctrine. From the outset, the states were described as laboratories of experimentation in the canonical text of the American democracy. But the institutional plan of American federalism, with its rigid allocation of powers, works against the tapping of this experimentalist potential. So you can imagine then a renovation, a re-energizing of federalism that would advance in two stages. In the first stage, the focus would be on broadening the facility for cooperative federalism, for vertical or horizontal cooperation within the federation. So vertical cooperation is cooperation among the three levels of the federal system in the pursuit of particular experiments. And horizontal cooperation is cooperation at the same level among states or among municipalities. Cooperative federalism is a powerful instrument of institutional experimentation. But then would come the second, more radical stage. The second, more radical stage is a stage in which we would relax the constraint of uniform divergence. Here's what I mean. As a society goes down a certain track, it would want to hedge its bets by allowing certain parts of itself to create counter-models of the national future. Not just abstractions, doctrines, but actual examples. They have to be translated into practice. Now, if we impose on the principle of divergence the requirement that the right of divergence be uniform throughout the federation at any given time, the amount of divergence that can be tolerated at any particular time will be very limited. So we have to relax this constraint and allow particular states or even sectors of the economy, networks of firms, to apply for a right of wide divergence from the dominant national solutions. And of course, the winning and exercise of this right would have to be subject to a double set of political and judicial constraints. It would have to be approved by the central bodies of the democracy, and it would have to be vetted by the courts in order to ensure that the divergence is not used to entrench the interests of a particular class or group, or to prejudice or subjugate the interests of another group. And it's easy to imagine how the jurists would develop intermediate doctrinal categories that would serve this purpose. So the same idea can be applied in a unitary state. A unitary state in which we would have stronger central initiative, but also radical devolution. It's possible to have both, more of each, depending on the detailed institutional arrangements. Yes?
So I have a little problem with this judicial review for diverging, because I doubt that the highest court, usually the Supreme Court in the US, for example, would actually always work in favor of the discriminated groups. So just to give you an example, in the US, you usually have, when it comes to First Amendment, there is the idea of experiment and this marketplace.
Yes.
But till the 1970s, usually as a rule of thumb, the Supreme Court was ruling against any freedom of speech of socialists or usually Jehovah's Witness. This is when usually the free speech was constrained with new categories of fighting words, or there are different doctrines. But it was expanded when it came to KKK or right-wing groups.
Yes.
So it's not always true, but as a rule of thumb, this is what.
Yes.
What makes you think that this judicial review body actually does a good job?
It's not foolproof.
Training to the wrong
Yeah.
direction.
Well, it's not foolproof. They will act in the right direction, but there's a problem. There's a problem in this divergence, which is that the divergence has the potential of being used in a sectarian or class-bound fashion. So if you gave the example of the United States. In the United States, some development of the doctrine of equal protection would have to arise to deal with this situation. So you would allow divergence, but the divergence has to be conditional. It can't be a free-for-all. It has to be a qualified pluralism. And my thought is that the political constraint on this qualified pluralism, although indispensable, is insufficient. And there has to be some set of rules, doctrines, in principle developed in jurisprudence, in the jurisprudence of the courts, that would limit the exercise of this right of divergence to avoid its abuse in the service of the entrenchment of sectarian interests. This exercise can fail, of course, but I don't really see an alternative to it if we're to allow for the divergence. In this proposal that I've made, there are two checks, the political check and the judicial check. So we have, as it were, a double safeguard. But the potential for abuse is very large.
So this is where I'm struggling a little bit, because it cannot just be double constraint, but it can also be double discrimination. Because just as the political field, both branches actually can be just as discriminatory. Of course, but there's no ultimate guarantee in anything. That can happen in the central government, in the local government. There are no guarantees in this business of politics. So, you know, what's happened is, in the history of political thought, is the development of these fables, like natural rights, in which we tell each other stories that certain things are impossible to change in an effort to tie our hands. But we know that nothing is impossible to change. With enough power, you change anything. And so there's we design a system not with the thought that it guarantees us against the dangers of the future,
but that it mitigates these dangers, and it creates the possibility for these constraints. Now, the whole logic of the American constitutional regime is that constraint or safeguard or plurality of power is associated with inhibition and with stasis, with blockade, with impasse. But it's not true, because as I suggested in the argument about the hastening of politics, we can have a multiplication of sources of initiative and many constraints, but at the same time mechanisms that allow us to resolve impasse quickly. The Americans perpetuate impasse because they wanted to, not because they had to. And so then retrospectively they developed this theory that the fragmentation is inseparable from the slowing down. But it's not. It's patently not. And I'll give you another example of that. Another way to understand by analogy the point of this hastening of politics. You know that the French Constitution of 1958 and 1962, with its dualistic regime, a president and a parliament, a prime minister subject to both, provides for, as it were, two political times. There's a fast time in which the parliamentary majority coincides with the president. And then there's a slow time, which the French call cohabitation, in which there's a divergence between the president and the parliamentary majority. So I describe to you a system in which, in the vocabulary of the French constitutional regime, there's no slow time. There's only a fast time. And nothing prevents us from having such a regime. There's no reason to think that the provision of a regime that has only a fast time and no slow time somehow undermines or even weakens the safeguards of individual freedom, of political freedom. So this is the fundamental issue at stake in that part of the discussion. Whether this heating up of politics is by its very nature subversive of political freedom. And my fundamental argument is that it's not. And that that's the only way to reconcile the idea of political freedom with the idea of social freedom. Because if the state is unable to challenge the structure of society effectively without the provocation of crisis, then in the real society, some people will be oppressing other people in that established structure. And there will be an original distribution of advantage that will render people to subjugation. So under these conventional ideas, we establish political freedom only by suppressing social freedom. And what we need is a way of thinking about politics that puts political freedom and social freedom on the same side. Yes?
Would you consider the European Union such a project? Because you have...
Not in its present form, no. And that would be then another discussion of the European Union. The European Union, and there are many dimensions of this discussion, but one dimension is the following. The European Union has evolved under the principle that the organization of social and economic life is increasingly centralized in the authorities of the Union. In Brussels or in Berlin, and the ability to define the educational and social endowments of the citizens is devolved to the national or subnational authorities. It should be the opposite under this principle. That is, the vocation of the Union would be to secure the capabilities and endowments of all of its citizens, but then to give them the greatest possible latitude for institutional experiments. That would be turning it upside down. And it would be in the interests of, especially of the Mediterranean countries and the Eastern European countries, to press for this change in the arrangements of the Union. So they would see it as being in their national interest to organize the Union on different lines. We might come back to this in the context of the discussion about globalization. Because after all, the European Union is a precursor of an idea of globalization. Yes?
I just want to say about the European Union, to Kai. I think that what happened around Greece and Spain, which was a collision between the Eurozone and the European Union structure with some of the countries, suggests that there is a big problem in the European Union where institutions, the way that it is contrasted. Like if Obama had put, I don't know, Texas out of business like the directorate of the European Union did to Greece, he wouldn't be elected in the second term. And they could have done it and continue with their life, all the people there. It's a problem in my opinion.
Well, let's come back to this in the discussion of globalization. So there's a fourth set of institutional innovations that has to do with the solution of a particular problem, which is this. Under these societies, even with a more energized democracy, in an economy that will continue to be unequal, although we hope less unequal, it is always possible that there will be groups that will find themselves trapped in a circumstance of disadvantage or exclusion from which they are unable to escape by the means of collective economic and political action that are available to them. Therefore, there should be some power in the state or some branch of government that should be equipped, designed, and financed to come to the rescue of these groups, and that should have normative power to redesign some aspect of the institutional arrangements or of the structural constraints that are exposing that group to the circumstance of subjugation from which it cannot escape. Now, in the United States, to take the American example, this practice exists, but it exists in the form of a judicial practice. So the federal courts in the United States developed the practice called complex enforcement, or the structural injunctions, by which, in the name of an ideal attributed to the substantive law, they intervene in a local school system, or a prison system, or a network of mental hospitals, and they even take it over, and they reshape it under judicial authority. Now, what is this? What is this but a fragmentary example of precisely what I described? An intervention that is structural, and in that sense like legislation, but is at the same time localized, and in that sense like administrative or executive action. But of course, the judges assumed this role in the United States because they wanted to. And they persisted in this role only insofar as they were able to, until they ran out of power. So in principle, there'd be no reason why they would be restricted to prisons, insane asylums, and schools. Why not the banks, for example? In other words, not the central entities of production or of power in the society, but only these peripheral entities. So what we would want is that there be some power established in the state that would be designed for this purpose. And it would be another branch of government. It might be co-elected by the other branches. It would have to have independent financing. But the form of action would be unique because, as I say, it would be at once localized and structural. It would intervene in some localized part of the structural background of society to reshape it for this specific purpose of rescuing a group that found itself entrapped. Now, finally, the fifth set of innovations.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of like the baker of the cake, the baker who didn't want to create cake for a same-sex couple. What would be the burden of proof on subjugation?
Well, we're talking now about collective situations, not about individual.
Christians could say, like, you know, we're subjugated by laws
Yes.
that force us to serve same-sex people, or
Yes.
Or, so what would be, and you don't want to have to force subjugated people to prove their subjugation.
Yes, but
You have
this
a lot
would
of
apply.
dissonance when there are other people who would claim the same status as a group in a way that is better.
Correct. But here the issue is that this activity of the state would not be to repeat the work of the general civil rights laws, the laws against discrimination. We're talking here about some insular group that is in a particular part of the social structure that you can do something about. It's not just giving them rights in the abstract, that they have a right to use a public facility regardless of what the provider wants. That's not the issue. The issue is a group that's in a particular part of the structure. It might be some form of underclass, racially stigmatized workers, for example, and that are unable to escape that situation, or an oppressed caste in India or something like that. So they're an insular group, identified, associated with a particular part of the social structure, and it's possible to identify the structural constraints that are conspiring in their entrapment. Those are the preconditions of the action. In other words, it's not just a reenactment of the general problem of discrimination. Now then we come to the fifth set of institutional innovations. And those would be then, in a way, an attempt to recover something of that agenda of the leftists. Remember what I call the outer circle, the idea of workers' councils, of participatory government. Not as an alternative to representative democracy, but as an addition to representative democracy. So here the idea is that representative democracy would begin to take on, little by little, some of the traits of direct or participatory democracy, especially at the local level. And that we would begin to multiply forms of direct engagement of civil society in the management of its own affairs, parallel to government and especially to local government. And that enriching of representative democracy by traits of that enriching of representative democracy by traits of direct democracy helps elevate the level of organized popular engagement in political life. So it's, as it were, the realistic residue of that leftist idea of a government of councils incorporated into this larger institutional endeavor. Now, I just want to suggest this. I've described this direction at this intermediate level, and without reference to any particular national context, except in some of the examples. In any particular national context, there will be a sequence of what is best to come first and in what order. So take the United States. In the United States, the hardest thing to change would be the organization of the government, because that's the object of a cult, the Constitution. Now, it's unique to the United States that in the United States, the standard way of changing the Constitution is to reinterpret it. In the rest of the world, it's changed by being changed. So the Americans have to pretend that it means something different, for the most part. But this has a consequence of which they may not be fully aware, which is that it provides in the constitutional innovations a bias in the direction of the reinterpretation of rights, like equal protection or due process, and away from the redesign of the state. Because you can easily pretend that equal protection or due process means something different from what it was thought to mean before. But you can't pretend that the Constitution provides for 5 branches of government when it says that there are 3 branches of government. So the whole focus of constitutional innovation in the United States is then shifted to this discourse about the rights and away from the redesign of the state. And that has momentous effects on the possibilities of the American state and of American democracy. So that part of the program in the American context would be the most remote. Now, the American progressives often seem to think that they should begin with the relation between money and politics and the questions of the level of political mobilization and the constraints on political mobilization. But it seems that that's not the best way to begin. That's not the first step, because it's the object of intense contention in the United States. And that the best place in which to begin is in the third set of innovations having to do with American federalism. Because there is a widespread interest that cuts across the right wing and the left wing forces in the United States in re-energizing American federalism in the service of experimentation. And that might be the best place to begin. But that's an entirely circumstantial argument about the particulars of the context. So you would have to have a broad constitutional imagination that would see ahead, that would anticipate the direction, that would have large ambitions, the prophetic element in politics. But then you would have to identify the initial steps, where you begin. And where you begin depends on circumstance. And I'm making a particular argument that it may be that the best place to begin in the United States is in this relation between the center and the periphery, rather than in the relation between money and politics. Well, we still have a couple of minutes to discuss this, and I simply want to present to you, and we might discuss at the beginning of the next class, the following paradox or problem, and ask you what you think about it. So, the established institutions, especially the political institutions, are designed to make change depend on crisis. Then I say, let's have a set of institutions that weakens the dependence of change on crisis. But does it not seem to you that the introduction of these institutions would also depend on crisis? So in other words, that there's the threat of a vicious circle that we would somehow have to break. No society reshapes its politics, its democracy, in order later to decide what to do with a reformed democracy. It doesn't happen that way. It doesn't happen that you say, let's reform our political life. Then we'll decide how to use it. That's not how things happen in history. The organization of the state and of politics is changed only when it needs to change, because someone wants to do something in the collective life that needs to be done. Some change in the economic and social direction of the country. So now maybe then that observation suggests the beginning of an answer to this problem of the vicious circle. The only way in which we could break that vicious circle that I just described is by having a project, an economic and social project, and then the transformation of political life and of the character of democracy would arise as an incident in this struggle over the alternative national direction. We have 1 minute in which you can pose a question or a challenge to this idea. No. it's unfair, of course, but life is unfair. Okay. So we'll
This is the
continue
lesson
next
of
week.
the- this is the
Yes,
lesson.
yes. We could- Very good. I never worry about what happens to the work, but it would be terrific, sure. But doesn't everyone read English there?
No, I think that the people who are usually in the knowledge economy. No, I don't know how much it interests them, but I think in the social organism, they're going to read because they have a lot of stuff. No, they know how to read. But you have a lot of books, and one of the translation books. Not only, I think not only all. And if you would allow me to check in some of the publications that are interesting, I would love to do so.
That would be terrific.
So let me check some of the files. Thanks so much.
Discussing in the past about this idea of imagining the future. I wonder if the current structure of democracy is sort of almost a vicious cycle which doesn't let us imagine that things could be better.
It's not that it doesn't nothing ever prevents us from imagining.
That's correct.
Except our weakness.
Right.
But it doesn't allow us to,
מאוד,
to really
נכון,
imagine something.
ונשב רציני לדבר פנים
You
בפנים.
can't just imagine it in a fantasy. You have to be able to.
יש לי שיעור עם ניקולס, קורס.
You have to.
שמונה וחצי ל9
He has specific ones I think are on Friday, but you should ask him. Yeah.
From this experimental exemplification. It's necessary.
אז אני חושב שנשאר אחרי זה.
I don't know. I'm sure there is a question about how do you wake up the people who are asleep? As we've talked about, like people are asleep and that's why.
No, it's the method of political prophecy in education. It involves visionary elements. And then involves practical political prophecy always has to combine visionary teaching and example.
זהו, היה ממש כאילו, אני אפרד לך לחדש, נראה לי לא נכון. אני רוצה לספר לך, אבל היה לי משקט, מחנה, אני מקווה שלא חוזרים באחרים. אבל זה החניה.
The vision has to be credentialed by
מה
somebody.
יהיה מחר?
So, but that's one component. So the other component, that's the prophetic. The other component is the anticipatory or practical component. Make it okay. Show me. I can only believe that
טוב, בסדר, אני בסוף השבוע, אני חייב להגיד לך שראית מה שראית.
that is a foreshadowing of this alternative. So you have to be able to create something right now and to point something right now that you can hold in your hand and you can touch that anticipates this direction.
אז
That's
לא,
what
לא
powerful
יצא.
prophecy is. It's this combination of a tangible
אוקיי, אז תתארגני, תיסעי, עד שלא יצליחו איתך.
because both are necessary because the experiment